Okay, now covering the explanation about how Mary ties to Daniel. And since it might have been a week or so since you've seen this, we're going to do a little review first to, save you some time. Highlighted in black is the section where at the very bottom she is reconciling, literally reconciling like a balance sheet to Daniel. Paul is going to kick off on this, and he's going to use the same 56 because Daniel's using it. All right? Daniel's using it because Psalm 90 used it. And, of course, Isaiah used it in the middle, with the God being pregnant, the decree of God being pregnant with Messiah coming to, give birth. All right? So, each one of them referenced 56 in a different way. Paul's going to play off Mary because Mary's ending her Magnificat with the character of what her son is going to be like, based on Bible verses, of course, that talked about it. And Paul's going to pick up saying that he's writing in the year when Christ would have been age 56. So you see, they make a lot of wordplay on these meters. And the hardest one to explain is Daniel's. So that's why we got to go through all this extra stuff before we even get to Daniel. We've seen some introduction, but we're going to go through Daniel in more detail. So here in black, highlighted in black, is the time from when Christ was scheduled to die at age 40 until 16 years later. So 40 plus 16 equals 56. And again, you've got an adjustment there for beginning and ending of year. All right? Because he dies at the beginning of a year. That's the sort of kicker there. So you're counting two different things as full units, so you get an extra 1. That's why it works that way. Okay, but let's go back. You'll notice that this page is now looks different. It is the 9th page. See, I still preserved what you've been seeing on screen. This is still preserved. But now, inserted at the end, it's in widescreen so that you can see the time. Because it might be hard to remember what, these numbers each mean. So what I've done is I've inserted the dates. And the dates that I've inserted are, plus or minus a year. Plus or minus a year on either side, because any kind of event that's being pegged didn't really start at that year. Okay? It started a year prior and it probably went on for a year after. Okay? The pegging is usually done in the Bible. They peg things for beginning, and they're trying to show when a thing begins or when it ends. And sometimes they just peg it that way because it's in the middle and it's a meter, because you'll still know what the event is. Alright, so up here at 12, that's 152 BC, as I explained before. This is the verse that's being referenced. Not that Maccabees is Bible, but it was known at the time. Okay? This was 12 years after Hanukkah, aka 160 from the time of the Seleucids, because the Seleucids dated their empire to begin in 312 BC. Okay, so it's the 160th anniversary, 160th year rather, of the Seleucid Empire. That's how that Maccabees dates work. It's all in terms of the Seleucid Empire. Okay, so then this is 8 years later, 144, 143 BC, Demetrius being put on the throne of the Seleucids, and that's in 1 Maccabees 11:9. Then you got 134 BC, that's the rise of Hyrcanus. 129 BC, which she's tying off. This yellow means that she's tying off that section as if it were one syntactical unit. And if you just read it alone, you get one syntactical idea out of it. Especially if you're talking Hebraistically like she is. For he sees. he regarded as, I needed that for the syllables. But in pure Hebrew, it would just be God sees. That would even be somebody's name. All right? So, 129 BC, that's Antiochus VII. As a result of defeating him, Israel got a sizable amount of freedom. And then this is the defeat of Antiochus VIII, and that's referenced obliquely in 2 Maccabees, 1:7, and Israel got even more freedom then. That was kind of when the Seleucids were so effete that they kind of pretty much quit. This is the rise of Marius, and I didn't cover Marius enough. Marius is one of the more famous Roman people in history. He was a consul who had a great big fight with another guy named Sulla, and I didn't mention Sulla, so I've listed it now. I forgot to mention that in the videos. Okay, so this is Marius rising to power. He became the uncle of Julius Caesar. This is 110-109 BC. You have to think of it that way. That was when Marius changed the military to allow what they called plebes, meaning the common people, into the military. That radically changed everything about Rome's history. Okay, it gave people a voice that they didn't have through the comitia and the other, so-called voices they were supposed to have. They ended up having real power as a result of this. Okay, Hyrcanus in the same year defeats Samaria, and Samaria was not populated by Samaritans at that time. It was populated by Greeks who were loyal to these people, the Antiochus line. And so this resulted in even more freedom for Israel from her enemies. So these two big things Mary is benchmarking, because they had a huge impact on the future of where Israel was going to be under Rome. Okay, Marius got disgraced by Sulla. There was an ongoing battle between these two guys. It's a major impact in the development of the history of Rome. So Marius is disgraced. Sulla comes to power, and Sulla, it was Hatfields and McCoys between these two people. Okay, if Sulla had been the consul the year before, and Marius is the consul now, then everything that Sulla did the year before, Marius has to trash, and vice versa. This is how bad Rome was. Okay, so they call it, in modern historians call it, the social war, Sulla versus Marius. That was marked by this time. It had a huge impact on Caesar being able to come to power. It had a huge impact on how Romans thought of what government ought to be. Sulla retired in 81, and that was a major, major, major thing, because it's really rare for somebody who is a dictator to retire. So that speaks well of Sulla to a certain extent, but he was a jerk too. They all were. I mean, nobody's perfect, right? And then this is when Pompey rises to power, and that's the Spartacus Rebellion. They call it the Slave Rebellion. And this is when Pompey goes to the Middle East, and particularly into Jerusalem, okay, and tries to get in the temple, and there's all that, he gets some money from the temple, and blah, blah, blah. This is when Caesar becomes consul, okay, and you'll notice that Mary, as I said before, is likening this period to the millennium. First of all, because it's coming close to the millennium. There's only 98 years left on the clock when she speaks, and this is not, a whole lot before that. All right, another 100 years. That's still not very much to the end of, when the millennium's going to come, compared to 4200 from Adam. She's likening that. When she uses this 98, she's making a metaphor of the import of that time. The last 50 years, last 57 years of history were already foretold ever since Moses and enshrined in the Mosaic Law as being a horrible time of history. But then after that comes the millennium. That's the point she's making. Okay, and this was civil war time in Rome. It was on again, off again kind of thing between Sulla and Marius. It was really gross. Okay, but as far as Israel is concerned, this is exactly what needs to happen for Israel to get freed of her own apostasy. So it's really clever that Mary's doing this. And of course there's 35 syllables between the 63 here and the 98 here. Okay, So that's when Pompey's in the Middle East, and again, it was a several-year campaign. So, pegging it at 66, going down to 63, when he actually goes into the temple, or tries to. I think he actually went in, and then saw that nothing was there and couldn't understand why, the Jews revere it so much. Okay, then this is pegging it at 105. And she's making a point, so that's why I boxed this section, because that's a 7th paragraph all by itself. So when you read the text of that section, it's got its own syntactical sense. Same thing here. When you read the text here, just by itself, it's got its own syntactical sense. We went through that. Same thing here. This is boxed to go to the 42, and that's got its own syntactical sense. Okay, 35 is God votes. 42 means at least one generation of man is voting in troubled times. And that's how she's characterizing the time. And of course, the humiliation makes sense. All right? 63 means vote short. That means Israel's so apostate that God has to step in and do something, which is exactly what is being recorded here in the history. Because if it weren't for Marius making the change in the military, there would have been no Rome to come in and help. All right? And here's the time when Rome comes in and helps. Caesar, who's marked here, it wouldn't have mattered that he got elected consul if Marius didn't make the change in the military back here. All right? So this is a syntactical unit and takes us down to Caesar becoming consul. He's a young man in debt at this time. Crassus is his sort of mentor. And Crassus, Pompey, and the junior Caesar, form what modern historians call the first triumvirate. Really, Caesar was a nobody at that point, but he took advantage of his position. And again, remember, he's a nephew of Marius. That put him under a cloud during the Sulla years, but when Sulla retired, that all changed. Okay. So here's our next syntactical unit ending at 133, and that covers the crossing of the Rubicon, which really took a year and a half. That covers something I forgot to mention, which was Herod becoming tetrarch. Mary is turning full circle now to her own birth when she counts this. She was born in 35 BC because she's saying she's 35 here. That's her dateline. And she should have it as a dateline. She's a royal person. You're supposed to date in years from the king. Okay, well, the king is in her womb, so she has to date from herself. All right? So, that's when Herod became tetrarch, and she's also dating from when Herod became... King Tetrarch wasn't really king yet, but it would happen 3 years later, so... she's dating it back to the first time he got into power. All right? And then we got Battle of Actium, which made Julius Caesar's nephew, Octavian, become Augustus. Well, he's called it Augustus 4 years later. Okay, that's when he won over Antony and I want to say it was Cassius. Cassius had been defeated first, then Antony, and Herod, who was up here appointed by Antony. Okay, he took the wrong side. He should have taken Octavian's side, but he ends up making Octavian like him, and so Herod retains his power. See, all this was necessary for Israel to be preserved. That's what the timeline is for. That's why it's measuring from Hanukkah. Hanukkah was when Israel got free, so that her temple could be, up and running again. That's the theme of this. All right? And then we get the famous, this paragraph starting here, all the way down here, is 84 syllables. The same as Psalm 90 verses 1 through 4. You've seen me show that now. Okay, it's just all one unit. So she's treating this whole section in black as having one theme, one purpose, one goal, which is Messiah to come and pay so that the word of God is fulfilled to Abraham and his seed, singular. This is spermati. I'm saying my bad English. Okay, until forever. Paul's going to pick up on that in Galatians. I think it's Galatians 3 where he quips. Well, the promise wasn't made to seeds, plural, but to seed, singular. Yeah, and here's where Mary uses seed, singular. It's really cute. See, Abraham's seed is Christ. That was why Abraham wanted to leave Chaldea and go to, what became Israel. That's why he did it. Your seed is going to be the Messiah. That was the promise. That's why everybody stuck to Abraham. All right? So, the promise of it being fulfilled is all in the womb of God, the decree of God, theme of Psalm 90, verses 1 through 4. And of course, I've gone through how the text ties. The thrones, the humiliated. This was a tie to Tiberius. This ends up being another tie to Tiberius, because Tiberius is recalled. I explained how this applied to Christ, but I didn't show you how it applied to Tiberius. Tiberius was humiliated at the time Mary writes this. But he had been lifted in 13 BC when she is talking about, that back time. All right, he was promoted, then he was demoted when there was somebody else that Augustus liked better, then he was promoted again, then demoted again. Every time Augustus got sick, Tiberius's name came to the fore because he was the oldest guy. Everybody else was too young. All right? Okay, well, now when Christ is nearly age 30, which Luke is going to cover in Luke 3, Tiberius is recalled, is remembered. And they consider them doing themselves a great favor to him. Yeah. He was just about to, retire on Capri, and he gets recalled, and then Augustus doesn't want him anymore, and then Augustus gets sick in 12 AD. So that's when Tiberius really permanently gets co-regency. Okay, well, he had been co-regent for nearly 15 years at this point. Again, you have to sort of round off 1 year plus or minus because of beginning and ending of year. But Luke 3 is going to be saying that, bluntly. In Tiberius's 15th year. Well, that's what this is, presaging. All right? Christ was scheduled to die, and he was 40, and again, because of our BC AD problem, okay, we have to say that he was born at the end of 4 BC, so we have to say that he died at 37 AD. That was the schedule. Paul has a 2-year difference in his Anno Domini accounting, so we might be able to adjust that to 2 BC. But I haven't yet figured out if I'm making a math error, so we're going to stick with the traditional. This is according to traditional accounting that we use, even though we know it's wrong. 37 AD, Christ was scheduled to die. And katos elelesen pras tus pater. That's 10 syllables. He would have been face-to-face with the Father. And this would have really been ton if it had been singular. Okay? So katos elelesen pras ton pater. Pateron. Alright? So I guess you just say pateron, leave out the ton. Because then it's 10 syllables. Okay? You have to sort of change it up for the wordplay to work. Alright? That was really cool. And then we end with our famous 54, because Christ would have been 40, and now you're counting time in terms of kings, years from a king. Christ is born. This is how Paul's doing it. Christ is born here. We call that at the end of 4 BC. You have to use 3 for accounting purposes. All right? So he would have been 40 at this point, and then you have to count 14 years after that to get to the 54 that's owed due to Abraham maturing too early. But you count 16 because in the Mosaic Law you had 50 years. I've shown this to you before. In the Mosaic Law you had 50 years that were owed to the Gentiles. That was represented by Jubilee. Okay? And you also had, at that point, not just another 4 years, but you had 7 years. See? This is when David would have died. The 1000th anniversary of his death was the end of time. So the 57 years had to begin here because of the temple being started late and all that other good stuff. All right? So then you have 50 years going from 4150 to 4200 from Adam. 4200 from Adam, the millennium should have begun. The last 50 years in the Jubilee accounting. It plays in reverse order. The last 50 years, Jubilee accounting is paid back for Abraham, and during the 7 years, that's the payback for the extra 4 years. But it actually plays in reverse. In other words, the 50 would be, you'd start your count of a 50 here at 4143. The 50 years would be up at 4193, and the last 7 years of the tribulation, and that was supposed to be when the millennium began. You got to remember that, because when we go back to Daniel, you're going to need to remember that because Daniel's got that firmly in mind. That's where the 56 is coming from. It's between the two events. See, it's 57 if you're counting one of the 2 days, one of the 2 years. But it's 56 if you're counting between them. And since 56 is divisible by 7, that was often done a lot. Okay, because if you say 56 instead of 57, then you until the last minute you can escape this outcome. That was the idea. So 217 minus 164 equals 41. Again, beginning of the year, it's really 40 years left. All right? So that's where Mary stopped. She stops here to take into account the 56. She stops here, because that's 57, which I just showed you, from 4143 from Adam to 4200 from Adam's fall. Those last years were reserved for the tribulation and the harvesting of the Gentiles, which included the 54 years of paying back for Abraham's too early maturity. That's why she's talking about Abraham here. She's claiming the credit, but she's claiming it in an updated manner based on this thing. Okay? Because David had been dead already. They knew this timing ever since David died. So she's reconciling to both Moses' too early maturity, Abraham's too early maturity, which is back up here. She's reconciling to that because there's 54 years between 2100 and 2046. And she's also reconciling to the update due to David's death and the fact that the temple started 3 years late. So instead of 54 owing, it's now 57, 53 and a half plus 3 and a half technically. So 50, including the 53 and a half plus another 3 and a half, dates back to David, because that was the end of Jewish time. That was when Christ's deadline to die was, and that's equivalent to 37 AD, which Mary is reconciling to right here. 37 AD. Let's see if I can make that larger. There. 37 AD. See? Okay? So, that was what she's reconciling to, and 57 years remained on the clock at that point. 54 of which pay back for Abraham. The other 3 and a half pay back for the lateness of the temple. Now, that would assume, and because we know that's not how this turned out, that would assume that the extra 7 years owing on the 49 missed sabbatical years were used up by Christ in his own lifetime, that he lived that long. That would be the 62nd week. But if Christ didn't live that long, then you have 2 sevens, and he didn't live that long. Instead of dying in 4143, he dies in 4136. So we have an extra 7 that has to play before time can end. So you have, in essence, 2 tribulations. And this particular one, the 7 too early, is going to play in the 7 years that it takes to take out the temple, between whether you want to call it 64 to 70 AD or 66 to 73 AD, which we all know is Titus in the temple. Okay? You with me on that? We got 2 sevens now. This was the first one, all right, that would play in reverse. The 50 years starting in 4143, ending 4193, 7 years in 4200. That was the original schedule. But because Christ dies early, we got a second 7. Now, how's that going to play? That's really important. Mary is reserving, therefore, the 14 in here, because at the time she talks, he's not born yet. He could have lived the full 40 years had Israel not rejected him. And then there'd really only be 1 7 left. But from Christ forward, that whole 14, she's pregnant with it. Because God is pregnant with it. Psalm 90, verses 1 through 4. So now we're ready for Daniel. Okay, so now we're looking at both Mary in the top window, focusing on that text, how the Abraham payback is going to work, plus the 56, because the 56 is the last 57 years of history measured between the beginning year and the ending year. And to do that, Mary's playing on the 47 of Daniel. Paul will do that also. This is such a sophisticated accounting in Daniel that I'm afraid I'm going to lose you, but I'm going to just try and go through it as simply as I can. Fortunately for you, I've already written up the explanation in the chart there. In other words, if you were to click on the 919 here, just click on that number. See, here's the Daniel chart. And if you click on the 919, you'll go straight to the footnote that's covering it. And let me make this bigger so that you can see it. You understand where we are in Mary, okay? Because I'm going to cover that up. I'm sorry my voice is so hoarse. I've been talking too much. This is the chronology chart that matches this, that goes with this. So when you click on these underlines, any of the underlines, you go to the note that talks about that part underlined. Alright, that's true in all of my Word docs. But you have to use it in Word in order to get that to work. And in order to be able to use your Word doc like a browser, you have to go to, where is it? Sorry for all these digressions. You have to go to View in the Customize Commands bar, okay? And you're looking for, oh, it's not View, it's not in View. Where is it then? Web, yeah, you go to the Web section. See the Web section in Customize? And you pick, you take one of those, you pick that, and you literally put your, click your left mouse button hard on click your finger on the left mouse button and keep it depressed. That's called dragging. And then you move your mouse to the upper corner. See where you see these marks? You move it to the upper corner here, and then you let go of your mouse when you're up in this part of the menu, like that. And then you get your back button. And if you wanted to remove something, you do the same thing. You press your left mouse button and you keep it down. That's called dragging. And then you drag the thing that you don't want anymore back to the customize dialog box, and then you let it go. And that's how you remove it. So that's how you can convert your Word document into a web browser. Alright? So now you can just click on the underlined link as if you were in a browser, and you go straight to it. So now we're back on the topic again. Alright, Daniel 9:19 uses 47 because the amount owed, let me increase the size of that. See, the amount owed is 54 versus Daniel's 47. Alright? Now you'll notice that means that he's debiting 7. What is he debiting the 7 for? He's debiting the 7 for the tribulation, because that was already part of the Mosaic Law was already forecast and explained ever since Passover was invented. That's what Passover week is for. Its flip side is booths. And I don't know how common it is in Judaism today, but it is somewhat known. I know that. But it was commonly known for centuries that the Jews expected the millennium to arrive at the Feast of Booths, which is the flip side of Hanukkah. You remember, they have a bifurcated calendar. The sacred calendar begins in Nisan, aka the third week of March, if they did their calendar right, and they don't do it right anymore. And then the civil calendar begins in the first of the seventh month on the sacred calendar, which they used to call Itanim, and that's when the Feast of Booths occurs, which you can see in 1 Kings 8. Unfortunately, the Jewish calendar today is messed up. First of all, it's a solar calendar per the Bible, Exodus 12. Secondly, all the months per the Bible and per David's design of the priestly courses in 1 Chronicles 24 are 30-day months. Otherwise, the priesthood's courses wouldn't work. It's based on a 24-hour day. That's why there are 24 of them. Okay, and all the months had 30 days except the last one, and you ran out the clock for the extra 5 or 6 days in the last month called Adar, and then you'd be starting your year every year on the vernal equinox. That's how the calendar worked. That's not how the Jews run their calendar now. And they've been off in running it for, I don't know, centuries. Really, I don't understand why they got it wrong. But it was wrong in Josephus' day. Okay, that's why Josephus' numbers, they're all wrong. They don't balance. None of his numbers balance to the Bible. Because he's talking off the top of his head, or he's using God knows what. Of course, all the records were probably destroyed at Masada, and, people were pretty confused in those days. So you got to cut him some slack. But Daniel knew his numbers. And the last 57 years of the last 1050 in history was supposed to be characterized by 50 years for harvesting the Gentile, that was represented by Jubilee, and then the 7-day week of Passover, which was, a lot of Jews thought, would usher in the millennium at the Feast of Booths 6 months opposite the first month on the calendar. If you range the calendar as the first 6 months and the second 6 months side by side, they mirror each other in the first of their respective months. The first month of the sacred calendar is mirrored in the first month of the civil calendar. Okay? The 10th day of the month of Passover is when you set aside the lamb. The 10th day of Tishri, they call it today, Itanim, that's Yom Kippur. You see? The 14th day was Passover on the left-hand side of the calendar, starting on the third week of March, aka Nisan. And the right-hand side of the calendar, the 14th day of that month was supposed to be the Feast of Booths. So it was a solar calendar. Otherwise, those days would never be opposite each other in a wandering calendar. It would never work. But hey, people don't care about time. They should. They'd feel a lot better about the Bible if they did. Daniel did. As you can see, I'm giving you time to read. Daniel's debiting for the tribulation. They're 54 years old to Abraham. Okay? 54 years old due to Abraham. He is subtracting the tribulation from that. Okay? The other way you can handle it, and I haven't decided which way is decisive, is that he's subtracting those 7, remember? He's subtracting the 7 extra years owed on the 49 from that. See, 49 and 7 is 56. You get the pun? All right? He could be subtracting the hanging Chad 7 of the 62nd week from there, which would imply, if he's doing that, it implies he knows that Messiah will die early. I haven't worked through all of his math yet to be sure which of the two he's doing. But he's definitely allowing for that contingency. That's for sure, you can say that. Because this last thing, see, this is short 56 years. Right there. He's putting the whole 14 in here. This is 252, which I've yet to cover, plus 14. Okay? So he's subtracting only 7 from 54. He wouldn't be subtracting anything from 54 if he wasn't allowing for a contingency that the 7 on the missing 49, the 49th year is when he prays. 49 sabbatical years are going to be up at the end of the year in which he prays. If he didn't expect or have some intimation that Christ would die early, this wouldn't be 47, it'd be 54. This wouldn't be 56, it would be 56 minus 7, aka 49. It wouldn't be a 742. There would be 7 sevens missing, not 8. So that suggests to me that he knew. Okay? Mary, therefore, must have some kind of intimation about it also, because she's allowing the whole 14 here. Because she should, because it's possible that he would live that long. Okay? She's allowing the whole 14 here. She's allowing the whole 57 here. She's aping what Daniel does with his total down here. Alright? But she's also recognizing the 47 because she included it up at the top symbolically here. See, you can use the meter symbolically because each meter has a doctrinal meaning. You can use it as a tag, and that's what she's doing with it. She's symbolically tagging the 47 in Daniel. Okay, right there at verse 19 in the bottom left-hand corner. She is therefore setting up a parallel. That's one of the features of a time poem, is parallelism. She's setting up a parallel to this time in history, and especially this particular section, which is the rise of Marius. So I told you how important that was. Okay? His female slave would not have been delivered if Marius didn't come to power. Wouldn't have happened. Okay? You know, God does everything supernaturally, but it's not magic. He does it through human agents because he chooses to do it that way. We have our own free will, and God knows in advance what we're going to do with it, and then he chooses what he wants to make out of us using our free will. That's something the Calvinists will never understand, and I give up trying to explain it to them. Okay? You have free will. God isn't forcing you just because he knows the outcome, and he tells you just because he decrees it. He's decreed your freedom. That's the decree. You are free. God is powerful enough to make any use he wants out of what you freely do. Nothing stops his purpose, including your free will. Duh. Okay. So that's illustrated here. Marius did what he did because he wanted to do it. He wasn't even a believer. Okay. But God used what Marius did to create the freedom. You know, Marius ends up disgraced. Marius has his purpose. He ends up disgraced by Sulla. Okay. But God used this change to create a Caesar that ended up freeing Israel from herself. Okay? So this 47 is important. Now, you have to, again, each meter has a doctrinal meaning, and one of the few things in which Christendom universally agrees, including Judaism too, is that 40 stands for wandering in the wilderness. 40 stands for you were a bad boy or a bad girl, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, so you're going to get 40 years of wandering. Meaning 40 years of delay, meaning 40 years of remedial training, you know, stuff like that. The number 40 in the Bible stands for some kind of remedial time that you got to spend. And it's almost always literal. Okay? 7 stands for Passion Week. Stands for Booths. Booths on the right-hand side of the Jewish calendar, beginning the civil year, first month of the civil year. They lived in booths to remind them of wandering in the wilderness. Okay, and on the left-hand side of the calendar, the first month of the sacred year was when they were first having an exodus that ended up making them wander in the wilderness, because the first year that they were out, the very first year they were out, they got all nervous about the giants in the land and started crying and stuff. You can read all about that in Numbers. Okay? So the two holidays on either side of the calendar are mirrors of each other, and they cover the same period and the same meaning. So the 7 always meant there was trouble. And it always meant a germination, because, hello, the whole germination of the entire Israel was due to Exodus, which is celebrated in 7 days. Feast of Booths, 7 days. To remind them of germination, firstborn. Okay? The firstborn son was going to be sacrificed just like all those firstborn sons were sacrificed in Egypt. So all the firstborn sons in Egypt who died didn't die in vain, because they've been commemorated ever since. And of course, any of them that did die, died because they weren't believers. Because if you believed, you put the blood on the door. Because everybody had advance notice about that. So if you believed in the warning, you put the blood on the door and your firstborn didn't die. So the only people who died were those who didn't believe it. So it wasn't unfair. Okay, but I digress yet again. All right, so 47 has that doctrinal meaning. It's really important to this accounting. Okay, technically speaking, all right, what Daniel is doing with his 47 is he's omitting it from the 54 owed Abraham. What he's doing is acknowledging that there's actually a 14-year shortage, not just 7. So he knows that this 54 cannot complete unless the other 7 that's owing on what? The 49 missed sabbatical years. Unless that other 7 is made up. 49 and 7 is 56. You see that now. You see the tie. Mary's thus balancing to the very same thing down here. She's balancing to Abraham because that's part of it. She's also balancing to the extra 7. That's why it's 14. I say this because Christendom doesn't know about it. Okay, not even the dispensationalists understand that there were 2 7s. The Calvinists, of course, do not understand prophecy at all. But the rest, the dispensationalists don't understand. There are 2 7s here. You know, and I don't know why the scholarship has been so incompetent. It's right there in the numbers. It's just been incompetent for 2,000 years. I can't explain it. I don't think that, these are just the numbers. Anybody could do these numbers. I'm a brainout. I'm nobody special. Just the numbers just add up. They balance. Count syllables. See? They balance. There's your 62 weeks right there in Daniel 9:13. All right? And then, he repeats it for good measure in another way by using 62. He repeats it there, 69. I'm going to have to get to that. But the point I'm trying to make is with the 47, Daniel is eliminating or adjusting for the fact that there are 2 of them. Now, whether this particular reduction is a reduction for the tribulation, I kind of doubt that. It's probably a reduction for the extra 7. But then the problem I have is I have to explain to myself and to you this part right here. See, 69, that also means a week short. You got a 42 here. That's also referencing a week short. See, 42 from 49 is 7. He keeps debiting. I mean, this is a generational number, but it's also 7 shy. He's already done the 49. He's already closed his point. If you look at the text, okay, Daniel 9:4 is reminding God that he's a God of covenants. Okay, when he comes full circle to his own time in the timeline using the Isaiah timeline over here. I'm sorry this is so complicated. You'll have to read it. I can't explain it all. When he comes there, he's bookmarking. See, he's telling you that everything between this 49 and this 49 covers the same idea of why the sabbatical years were missed, and it's finally owing to Manasseh. It started with Rehoboam. 344 divided by 7 equals 49. That Rehoboam came to power, 930? 970, yeah, 930. So do the math, okay? And the second 49 here is keyed to Manasseh. This whole thing is keyed to Manasseh. He's making a play between Solomon and Manasseh on the 2 time tracks, because Solomon prayed a prayer that you can read in 1 Kings 8 about the temple. And I think that's where, do I list it there? Where do I list it? When I get to 9:13, yeah. If you read this section, it's too long for me to talk about on screen. When you read this, see, in 2 Kings 21 and 2 Chronicles 33, that's where God said, because of Manasseh, this temple's going down. There's nothing going to change that. All right? So, Daniel sets up this dual time track linking Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8, okay, when he dedicated the temple, to Manasseh being the cause of its irrevocable downfall. Now, when he does that, the irrevocable downfall here happens due to his reign, but Manasseh is captured in 649 BC at age 49. Okay? So when he bookends it here in his number 1 time track, he is at the time of Manasseh, which is the same as syllable 133 in the chronology that Isaiah had developed. So he's coming full circle. And he's using the age of Manasseh being 49 as the cause of the 49 years being, having to be played out because the temple's going to go down. And he's linking it back to Solomon. And if you go back to those verses, okay, in 9:13, if you go back to this section, you'll see it talks about how Manasseh didn't get rid of the kind of idols and stuff that Solomon allowed. So Solomon and Manasseh are being deliberately linked in the meter because they're deliberately linked in Kings and Chronicles. Okay, that's the problem. So he's basically developing, it's a legal thing that he's doing. In these verses, he's developing the, let me just do this full screen. Okay. All of these verses seem to say the same thing in English, in different, slightly different phrases, but it's basically mea maxima culpa in every verse. All right, but what he's really doing is he's tracking the kings. As I've said before, this is David in verse 6. Verse 7 is Solomon through Asa's 11th year. And at this point, Daniel has expended 182 syllables to say that. And that's exactly 49 greater than 133. Because Manasseh in 649 BC, of course they didn't use BC, but Manasseh's 49 when he's captured. And that is the time that Isaiah is measuring in his syllable 133. Okay? It's these 2 verses, Psalm 90 verse 7 and Isaiah 52:13 and 53:2. But 53:2 is the time of Manasseh in the chronology that Isaiah is using. And I cover that in my Isaiah 53 meter hypothesis playlist and Isaiah 53 exegesis. I walk you through that. I haven't finished it yet. But I get that far with Manasseh. So there's a 49-year difference between syllable 182 and syllable 133 in Isaiah. So he's doing it on purpose. There's no doubt about it. And he's linking it to Solomon because Solomon was the guy who allowed, because he was all hot on his wives and everything, he allowed the bad pagan practices to continue. Okay? He allowed it. And so that's why these two names are linked together in two different timelines. Okay? And then Daniel keeps on benchmarking Isaiah's syllable counts to go full circle right here, and that's where the other 49 ends. See, he's in his time track 2, because he's been linking up to Isaiah. He's using time track 2 the way Isaiah did, and in Isaiah's syllable 252, that's when Daniel is back at 538 BC. And that's why he's using 49 here, which in time track 1 is the time of Manasseh. See how sophisticated this is? Okay, so you've heard enough about 49 now. You get the point. 49 missed sabbatical years, on which 7 more sabbatical years elapsed. So there's a 7, extra 7, that cannot play pre-Messiah. So that's why 434 is used. That's why God says 62 weeks. The 62nd week is the repayment. See, there's 56 years after 434. The 62nd week is to be the repayment of Messiah. For Messiah. He's supposed to live 40 years. But he might not live 40 years. And Daniel is taking that into account when he uses 47, as I showed you up here. See, he's debiting it from the time that's owed Abraham instead of leaving it alone. He's debiting it. So he must have known, he must have had some intimation that he ought to debit it like that to get his 56 remainder. In other words, the reason why there's a 56 remainder is that 62nd week might not play, which means this has to be 47 instead of 54. I know you're probably going to have to read the document, which you can get in the video description. The link is in the video description. You're going to have to read this and mull it over. I've been working on this for several years, so it's really easy for me to say and understand, but I don't know how easy it is for you to understand while you're hearing me talk. Use 1 John 1:9 and talk to God a lot about it. That's how I learned this. Okay? So Mary is taking all that into account by also still using 56 rather than 49. You see that? Okay. Now we have to say one more thing about 47, which we started to say. Remember I said this was symbolic? 40 years stood for remedial, wandering in the wilderness. 7 years stood for tribulation. Okay? A time of, worse than normal persecution. Okay? Remember the 7 lean years and 7 fat years in Joseph? That's a precedent item. In the 7 lean and 7 fat years, what they were telling you is that was 33 and 7 total of 40 years back to back. So that the 2 7 years, the fat years and the lean years, were in the middle. So you had 33 years of, regular stuff. And then in 7 years they had a bumper crop because Joseph was the vizier who reclaimed the Fayum Depression in Egypt. Encyclopedia Britannica talks about a vizier doing that, but doesn't say that it's Joseph. Okay, but it's the same time period that the Bible says Joseph was there. So you do the math. Okay? Then there were the 7 lean years, followed by another 33 years, mirrored. All right? It's the same idea. You got 33 and 7 equals 40. All right? If they can't play as a 47 debit, which is what Daniel's allowing for, therefore alerting the careful reader of the meter to the fact that there's going to be a problem with that extra 7. If they can't play that way, they can play as a 40. Okay, why? Because God reimburses time. Remember, he's allotted 40 years. Pretend that Tus isn't there, and this was Pyron. All right? That's 10 years after he's about age 30. So he dies about age 40, which is really 40 years and 3 months. Okay, if that doesn't play, he has at least lived 33 years. You got that? We got a 7 years owed here, being debited by Daniel. Okay, he's lived 33. So 7 and 33 equals the 40 he should have lived. It can be reimbursed if he dies successful. If he personally is successful on the cross, then all that time can be reimbursed. Just as Daniel's praying here for a reimbursement of time to take us to the last 57 years of history, right there. It would still balance, but it balances differently. It's going to balance based on Messiah's age, that he should have been, and the total ends up being what? 40 years. So the 7 is playing in a 40-year period to reimburse the 40 years Messiah should have lived, if he even lives 33 years but is successful. The same pattern as the Joseph lean years and fat years. Okay? Now, that means that the temple, gotta come back to this now. Oh, my computer's going bad. Okay, that means that the temple see, here's Christ dying 7 years early. The second temple's 490-year period, had it not been razed, had the first temple not been razed, would have ended in the same year that Christ actually died. So all the time allotted to the temple was completed at that point. But there's one problem. And this goes all the way back to the Exodus. That's when the Exodus occurs. Years 2666 from Adam's fall. Okay, but Israel doesn't enter the land until when? 40 years later. That's when Moses writes Psalm 90. She's 40 years late getting into the land. So the temple, which at that time was a tent, was not in the land for 40 years. So not only do we have that debit to handle about Abraham being owed 40 years, of 54 years, but within that we got another debit for a different set of books of the fact that the land, as it were, was cheated 40 years because Israel was stubborn for 40 years and had to wander. So, what is God going to do about that? Well, what does God do about that? We all know this history, but we just don't know its significance. 4136 temple time's up. 4136 Christ dies, Jews rejected him. Okay, but there's 40 years owing to the temple, even though its time is up, because it was late getting in 40 years to start with. So what happens? The temple goes down in what we call 70 AD. You can call it 73 if you want. The extra 40 years got paid back, and it took 7 years for that to happen. Okay? It started in either 64 or 66, depending on which version of AD you want to use. All right? That was the problem with Florus, who was the procurator after. There were a couple of them, but Florus was the guy in charge at the time that all this stuff happened. And that, that involved including the War of Masada that Josephus came out of, because he was a general fighting the Romans. Okay? So the temple goes down, but the actual warring period, which culminated in the temple going down, started in 64 or 66, depending on how you want to do your AD dates, and ended in 70 or 73, again, depending on how you want to do your AD dates. So the land had the same number of years of a temple standing on it, whether it's a tent or a built temple, as they should have had, because Israel should have entered the land the first year that she got out of Egypt. Okay, so that's 40 years that are taking place when? In the time of church, because church starts when? On Pentecost, which is approximately June, after Christ dies. The same year when he dies, on Pentecost, that's the book of Acts, that's when the church started, Acts 2, which Peter explained, going back to Joel 2. All right, so 40 years of church time, 40 years of time to the Gentiles, got spent, keeping the temple on the grounds, even though the time had changed. Okay, we still got 14 years, hello? Okay, but 7 of those 14 ended up getting paid in the first 40. This is very complicated, sorry. So the temple time that was owed the land, and the fact that Christ died, at age 33 instead. So 33 plus 7 is 40. So now the temple time that was owed, to the land, and 40 years owed because of Abraham, we're done. Okay, but there's still 14. Well, yeah, and God's just clearing the books of the 7 because the temple goes down. That's deemed to be Jewish time. That's part of it. The owing to the land is separate from the owing to the people. You got the land and you got the people. The land was entitled to the time it got it for 40 years. The people were only entitled to the 7, so they got it by the horror of how long it took for Jerusalem to go down, including the temple. You see that? All right, so 40. Oh, my computer's going down. Okay. Always when it's dramatic. So you got a 40 and you got a 7. 2 separate accounting pieces. Okay? And that's right here counted. My computer is just very slow right now. Lower left-hand corner in black. Okay? That is now accounted. And hopefully you got it about why 47 instead of 54. If not, I suggest you download the Daniel doc. The link is in the video description, and sort of mull it over and compare it to the Mary Magnificat doc. And if you still got questions, just yell at me.